Hello and welcome to the Tea on the Tea Trans in Conversation. My name is Dr. Tobi Evans. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. And I'm so excited to be joined tonight by Dr. Ryan Gustafsson. As we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are filming today on the lands of the Bunurong Boon Wurrung people and the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Our very special guest for today is, as I said, Dr. Ryan Gustafsson. Ryan is a podcaster, researcher, and writer and works at the University of Melbourne. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So my first and possibly most important question is, what is your star sign and what are your gender pronouns?
I'm a Gemini, reluctantly so. And,
Why reluctantly?
Just never seemed to vibe with, the kind of characteristics of a Gemini. I think my rising is Taurus. I've always felt more like a Taurus.
Okay. I love Tauruses, so that's great. I'm really glad to hear that. Love some Taurus energy in the space. And what are your pronouns?
I use they, them, or he, him pronouns.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear a bit more about you.
Yeah, as you said, I'm a writer and researcher based at the University of Melbourne. I also do some podcasting. One of them is kind of on hiatus, and that's a trans or history podcast. And the other one is like a recurring one, and that's on Korean adoption experiences. My research at the moment is on Korean adoption and diaspora, but my PhD was on quite a different topic. It was on the philosophy of nature and a particular French philosopher's thought. But there is, some continuity there. I use the same philosopher to approach and to inform the research that I do on Korean adoption, particularly on adoptee experiences.
Quite different, the PhD and the research now, but I feel like, with theoretical frameworks, it's obviously the same-ish lens, so it's quite useful for kind of being well, I'm looking at a different thing, but I'm using the same kind of looking glass to think about it.
I wonder if you would kind of have a similar experience where it's always in retrospect that you can sort of draw threads between all the things that capture your interests, especially academically. At the time, you're this is interesting, so I'm just gonna pursue it. It's always when you have to write that narrative. Oh God, how do I make this make sense?
Yeah.
And I think when I look back, even from my BA and honors, I think I've always been interested in understanding processes of marginalization in various forms. So whether that's in the way we think about animal life, which was kind of my honors sort of focus, and then the way we think about the human as being somewhat exempt from nature, part of nature, but also supposedly transcendent of nature, but also how nature and the concept of the animal is used to marginalize people. So I feel if I kind of trace that, it's okay, well now I'm looking at a particular form of marginalization in a particular community. But yeah, like you said, hopefully all those theoretical frameworks just inform, the lens that, as you say, that I bring to it. So.
And I think you're very right in saying you kind of see the threads in retrospect. You're oh yeah, they all had this thing or these kind of things in common, and it's nice to kind of have that and be well, they sound different on the face of it, but in fact there's some thread. So I would love to hear more about that in a moment. But my first kind of question, other than the admin and fun questions, is tell me a bit more about your gender journey.
Well, I'd say it's definitely ongoing. It's a similar theme where it's in retrospect, maybe there were some signs before, or maybe, particular feeling of discomfort that I didn't attribute to gender. Maybe that's, that was the body and the world telling me that perhaps, something wasn't really as harmonic as I'd like, or whatever. So I've identified as queer for a really, really long time since I was a kid. But it took me a long time, I guess, to be more open to thinking about my gender expression and gender identity. And so I started exploring that a bit more actively, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. And yeah, I went to the doctor, changed my name, asked people to use different pronouns and all of that. And that's probably been a slow process, but yeah, probably within the last 4 or 5 years.
Can I ask what that was like being a young person who was identifying as queer? It sounds like you're quite young. So what was that like?
I remember hearing the term bisexual, and I just thought, oh, that's me.
Yeah, I had the same moment with Wikipedia. I was like, oh, yeah.
Even at that young age, I knew that that wasn't something I should say. It was just like, oh, like I registered that consciously. And then it wasn't, I don't know how old I was. I was probably like 8 maybe or something.
Oh, wow, so quite young.
Yeah. And then it wasn't until I was a teen that I came out as queer. But yeah, I mean, it was a very isolating realization to come to as well, because or I knew that it wasn't something I should talk about or something I should declare or be open about. But it was a term that gave expression, I guess, to something, and it resonated with me. And I think that it's like obviously the power of these terms.
Yeah.
Even if now that's maybe not a term I would really still use for myself, I started to identify more actively as queer, and I think, again, in retrospect, I think that was also probably because it was really ambiguous with regard to whether or not that's referring to sexuality or if that's referring to gender. And so I kind of liked, I guess, how open it was. So that was my term of choice for a long time, and I still do identify as queer.
Awesome. And you also said that in the last kind of 4 years, you've entered the journey of transitioning, which, as you also said, is an ongoing journey. Can I ask what kind of, or if there was like one thing or a couple of things that made you be like, oh, like I'm gonna, I guess, pivot to the type of queer that I'm like maybe expressing to the world?
I guess it's okay to say that I've watched other episodes of this. And something that one of your guests said kind of resonated with me, which was that I went out and got a script for tea before really thinking about what that might mean for my identity. So I guess the way that it came about is I reconnected with a friend who I hadn't been in close touch with for a while. Hadn't seen them for years, really. And we just happened to let's meet up again and like catch up for a beer. And they told me they were taking low-dose tea. And all of a sudden I was like, 1, I didn't know you could do that. 2, I was like, shit, I think I want to try that. And it's almost like that level of certainty came before, oh, I guess I'm trans. I feel like the maybe active identification with that term maybe came just slightly later, which scared me a little bit going to the doctor, and because it's usually about foregrounding your identity as a way to make a claim on your right to get medication. And I was like, I'm not sure how they're going to deal with it. Like, what story do I tell? To get what I want.
The age-old trans conundrum of how do I spin my own life so that I can get what I want? Yes,
exactly, and be sort of legible. But I was really lucky to have a really fantastic doctor who was just like incredibly open and was just like, well, just experiment. Like, if you want to do it, then do it. And if you don't, then if you decide that maybe this isn't for you, then that's fine. And was just very, had a really, really kind approach, I think, to things. And that really helped the beginnings, I guess.
I love hearing like of a medical doctor who's like, experiment, like it's your body, figure out what you want. Like, that's very rare, but very beautiful.
And was just very like, here's what you would need to know. Not to like, obviously push you down any path. I think it was just a very lovely model of the way in which doctors can just serve serve their patients, you know, and provide all the necessary information, but not be invested in any particular choice. Or I consider myself really lucky that he was the first doctor I saw.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, it shouldn't be like lucky; it should be normal. But
Exactly.
you know, love that, love that it worked out that time. So I'd also love to kind of hear about how your identity as queer, trans intersects with your Korean identity.
I think I identified as queer probably from a lot younger of an age than I actively identified as Korean.
Really?
I think knowing that you're born somewhere is not necessarily the same thing as taking up that nationality or ethnicity as a big part of your understanding of who you are. So, yeah, it's an interesting, I feel like there's been different rhythms, I guess, with regard to those two parts of my identity. It's been quite fascinating going from being quite visibly queer to kind of disappearing. I just never thought about the ways in which people that are perceived to be Asian women are looked at very differently to Asian men. And it's so strange because I don't identify as a man. But for me, when I was like, well, I still am transitioning, but it was incredibly difficult to know or pinpoint when people are viewing you as what they perceive to be a man, or like, you know, like that is just so difficult to kind of decode. And it's not like obviously you have to, but it certainly does help with social interactions and understanding like safety, you know, and all that stuff. So it's been quite fascinating seeing how differently people treat you when they think you are an Asian guy versus a quite visibly queer Asian woman. Maybe like another roundabout way to answer your question is like my particular identification as a Korean adoptee, as a particular type of Korean. That's probably also maybe a bigger part of the story, like a bigger part of my story, because growing up I didn't really connect with Korea as like a really tangible place. Like it was where, I knew I was born, but neither of my parents are Korean. And so that creates its own sort of complications or like complexities, I suppose. But yeah, in more recent years too, identifying, you know, more as Korean and also strongly as a Korean adoptee, it's also interesting to see how gender plays into that, because a really clear example is if you look for original family and they expect, they think they had a daughter, then you rocking up is confusing, and is quite a big, I'd say, like psychological barrier to even thinking about searching in the first place, because you just don't know how it's going to go, and you don't know, you know, no one wants to, you know, suffer rejection or be turned away. And so it's like there's so many barriers already when you're, I guess, deciding to search, if that's what you want to do. And then being trans kind of like complicates that quite a bit. The ways in which they complicate each other, but then also like how many parallels there are between being trans and being an adoptee. I think, I feel like my dream is to like write like a creative scholarly thing that like, I don't know, creatively think about ways in which they could inform each other. So I'm also like endlessly excited every time I meet another trans adoptee, to just kind of like, you know, try and, I guess, understand myself a bit more through having conversations with them.
Kind of leaning into your research, so your current major thrust of your research is Korean adoptees in Australia, or broadly?
Both.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Why that area specifically?
It just falls through the cracks when it comes to a lot of areas of research. So I think that was like interesting as like someone trained in academia too, to be like, okay, well, it's sort of family studies, but it's not. It's sort of migration studies, but it's not. It's definitely racial and ethnic studies, but it hasn't really been looked at within those fields too much, other than transracial adoption in the US specifically has. So it seems to be like this phenomena that like people, one, seem to have like a lot of really strong feelings about.
Could I unpack what the strong feelings are? Because like I know nothing about this.
Oh, right,
so
right.
what are the strong feelings people have about it?
I think on a broad level, just the notion of adoption as either, I think a mainstream view is it's a win-win solution to a problem of abandoned children and, at least in the modern era, like families who cannot conceive naturally. I think there's also this notion that it's, so it's a win-win solution. It's a benevolent act. It's always good. It's a charitable thing. That the adoptee should feel grateful for the life that they have. So it just has a lot of, I guess, quite strong moral, I guess there's this strong like moral discourses around it. And because it involves children, of course, it's very, very heightened politically and ethically. Yeah, so I guess that's what I mean by strong feelings.
Is your research like interviewing adoptees? Is it like more of a process? Like what are you kind of focusing on? Because I imagine it's like a huge topic, as all as all research topics are.
I have interviewed some Korean Australian adoptees, although I still have to finish the analysis for that. But I did, at the very start of COVID, interview adoptees who have returned to Korea to live, which is a small community. And that was really, really interesting. Yeah, I interviewed them about what it's like to make that decision and what life is like in Korea, how they, forge connections there, how they create a livable life, and, their plans for staying on or returning to their, to where they grew up. So I've been doing, some interviews, but then also a lot of, like reading adoptee memoirs and looking, I guess, more at like the social and historical context for the emergence of Korean adoption and its continuance.
That's awesome. So what have you found? So like, what's your hypothesis so far?
It's quite clear that adoptees, as they grow older, are faced with a lot of complex challenges. I think for me, the more interesting questions are around how they make sense of their identities, how they narrate their lives, because a lot don't have access to information, and so when they're trying to piece together their pre-adoption histories, it's quite difficult to even know if what their paperwork says is even real. So there's lots of barriers to carving out a kind of coherent linear narrative. Again, another interesting, I think, tie-in with trans studies. So yeah, I think I'm more interested in less the whether or not practices should continue. Obviously, it has to kind of touch on that a little bit. And there's some really interesting international developments that people may or may not be so interested in hearing about. But with my background in phenomenology, my main interest is understanding lived experiences. And so one of the ones that really stuck out with the interviews I did in Korea is the sort of racialized experiences of adoptees, and how when they're part of the racial and ethnic majority for the first time in their lives, how that actually allows for kind of critical reflections on what it was like growing up in white dominant societies. And I think that's really, really interesting because they've grown up being, habituated to being looked at all the time. You don't look like anyone around you. They're often the only person of color in their families. And so, that that sort of becomes baked into the way they understand their bodies and the way they experience the world. And then, then what happens when they go and live long term in a place that they were born in? And what sort of, challenges arise with that, or what sort of like reflections do people have throughout that experience? I think that's really, really fascinating and an interesting kind of way of thinking about belonging and racial identity even, that perhaps is, maybe quite a niche community, but hopefully also has interesting things to say about identity more broadly.
So I'm seeing some parallels here between your research and your creative practice as well, because you're also a podcaster and a writer. I'd love to hear a bit about how you got into either or both of those creative outlets.
The creative writing, I think I wanted a space that felt like it was a space for me, and it wasn't academic. And I was just really interested in experimenting with what it might mean to kind of pursue these questions that I have about the meaning of these experiences through more creative mediums. And I think it's been like so rewarding. It's like, it's taught me a lot of things too about myself, and it's been a really good opportunity to reflect on like my priorities and what I think knowledge is and what I would hope that knowledge does in the world. And so, both like the creative writing and podcasting has been wonderful. Podcasting I got into, so the first podcast that I was doing is called the Call Me By My Name project. And that was with a good friend who is quite an experienced podcaster. And they were like, hey, like, why don't we, do a trans oral history podcast and basically just get to talk to people around Victoria.
The dream.
Yeah. So we did that for 2 seasons and it was awesome. And that one's on hiatus. And then the Korean adoption podcast I also do with another close friend. And that has also been like super, super interesting and rewarding. And we interview all sorts of like, interview practitioners to academics, to social workers, to artists, activists. So it's been a really great way to connect. And it's like a really good excuse to like reach out to random people and be like, you're really interesting and I want to talk to you.
Yeah.
And
relatable content.
I have a podcast, so like,
Nice. And what's that one called?
That's called Adopted Feels.
Cool. Awesome. So we are nearly at time. So I'd love to know if there's anything we haven't touched on today that you would be remiss to not mention while we're here.
I guess one thing, and because we touched on this when we first met, is like navigating doing research on something that's very close to you, or doing research on something with which you identify very much with. And I think that's been really challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, like, love to talk to you about this one day in more detail, but like kind of taking care of yourself and navigating having like a professional academic profile, but then also writing quite personal things and in creative writing outlets and getting it published is also quite an interesting thing to navigate, but nice also, I think, to have a balance and an outlet. So.
Yeah, I found when doing kind of work that's quite linked to my identity, like if you have a bad day personally, then it's still your job the next day, and you're away from the bad experience, but you're still like, you can't put it down, which is a benefit and a bit of a curse as well. But we'll have to talk more about that another time. So my last question is about joy, because we often see a lot of trans narratives that are about hardship and about tragedy and things like that. So I'd love to hear what is bringing you joy in your life at the moment, whether it's something big or small, anything at all.
I love reading. I read 2 like beautiful poetry collections recently.
Oh yeah.
One's Ocean Vuong's Time as a Mother, and Customs by I think Solmaz Sharif. Both were like absolutely stunning. I love reading for fun and like making space in my life to do that too, and not feeling guilty that I'm not reading for work. And the other thing that's cute is I like I have a nephew who was born pretty recently, and so I'm like a non-binary uncle, which is really,
Love
really
it.
cute.
Yeah.
And so I'm using the term unkie, and I hope it catches
Oh,
on.
Unky.
Yeah, and
Obsessed. Love.
Yeah, he is so cute and such a joy, and so I love spending time with him and the rest of the family.
Yeah, the rest of the family too, but mainly him.
I mean, I dare say he's the cutest one at the moment
Okay.
out of my whole family.
Okay. Big call. Big
Yes,
call.
big call. I think they would probably agree as well, so it's fine.
As long as you're on the same page, that's what matters. Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Ryan Gustafsson, the Vent TV team, and the team working on the Tea on the T Trans in Conversation, which is our operations officer, Meg, our program director, Alex, and myself, Dr. Tobi Evans. Thank you.